In 2005, a 10-year-old girl vanished during a church retreat in rural Vermont. No suspects, no witnesses, no trace. Her mother spent the next 2 decades living with silence. But nearly 20 years later, during a routine home renovation just miles from where the girl was last seen, a construction crew found something behind a sealed wall. What they uncovered inside would finally reveal what really happened to Eliza Clark, and who had been hiding the truth all along. They weren't looking for anything more than water damage. That's how these old farmhouses usually go: century-old floorboards soaked with time, raccoon nests in the walls, a draft that breathes like a sleeping thing. But what the renovation crew found beneath the crumbling Victorian wasn't a pest or a pipe. It was a crawlspace sealed tight behind 2 layers of wood insulation, and what looked like an old church bulletin folded between boards like a forgotten prayer. The space was small, just a shallow cavity under the staircase. No lights. No airflow. A tomb of sorts. Inside, wrapped in a faded yellow raincoat stiff with age, was a small water-damaged journal. The first page had half disintegrated, but the ink held like it knew it had one job. Just one message to pass on. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out." One of the workers said it aloud, then looked around like he wished he hadn't. The others stood quiet. No one reached for the book. Later, after it made its way into the hands of the county sheriff's office, a name was confirmed. Eliza Clark. 10 years old. Missing since August 2005. The diary hadn't aged well, but it had survived, and that was enough to shake something loose in a town that had long since gone silent on the subject. Meredith Clark didn't hear about the diary until a contractor called her personally, 2 days after the discovery. She was folding towels in her kitchen, the television on mute, the clock on the wall still set to daylight saving even though she hadn't changed it in years. Outside, summer rain pattered lightly on the porch roof. "Miss Clark," the man said over the line, "I think you might want to come down here." She recognized the address before he finished it. An old minister's house, just 3 miles from where she'd once packed a suitcase for Bible camp and reminded her daughter to wear shoes that wouldn't get muddy. She had done everything the way she was supposed to. Left a contact number. Sent her with a fresh inhaler. Trusted the church. That had been 20 years ago. She still remembered the raincoat. Bright yellow. Practically glowed in a crowd of other kids' gear. "She'll stand out," Meredith had joked then. "Like a little star." And now, 2 decades later, it was found wrapped around a child's voice no one had heard until now. She sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at nothing for a long while. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it wasn't even Eliza's. But part of her, some raw, unburied part, already knew the truth. Her daughter had written that message. And she had not made it out. Meredith Clark had learned how to live without expecting peace. Grief wasn't something you cured. It was something you arranged your life around, like a broken rib you stopped breathing too deeply on. She was 41 now, though most days she felt older. The kind of tired that lived in her bones. Her hair had gone gray too early and she let it. She wore simple cardigans and soft jeans and didn't bother with makeup except on Sunday mornings, when she still taught the youngest class at Gracewood Chapel. Coloring books and memory verses. The stories she used to read to Eliza. People had stopped asking how she was doing a long time ago. Eliza disappeared in the summer of 2005, during a youth church retreat at Haven Glen, a forested campsite built around a small lake. Meredith had dropped her off with the other kids that Friday morning, waved as the church van pulled away. Her daughter was smiling. Bright-eyed. Yellow raincoat, packed lunch, favorite stuffed lamb zipped into her sleeping bag. She never came back. For the first few years, the community wrapped around Meredith like a second skin. Candlelight vigils. Missing posters. Prayer chains and casseroles and whispered theories. She'd become the town's sorrow, the woman with the missing girl. But time has teeth. It gnaws at memory. The vigils stopped after the 5-year mark. Police reclassified the case as inactive. Volunteers drifted on to other causes. Even the church, her church, quietly retired Eliza's name from the bulletin. Meredith never left Franklin. Never remarried. She sold the old house and moved to a rental half the size, but stayed within walking distance of the school, as if Eliza might still show up one day with scraped knees and a wild story. The call about the diary hit her like a tremor. Not a full collapse, just the beginning ripple. The contractor's voice had been gentle, almost rehearsed. It was found during a renovation project. The address used to belong to a Reverend Holloway. You might remember him. She did. The old minister. Tall, soft-spoken, distant. He'd passed away in 2006, the year after Eliza vanished. No family left in town, far as she knew. The address was just 3 miles from where Meredith had lived in 2005. 3 miles. She drove there the next morning, hands trembling so hard she had to pull over halfway and breathe into a paper bag. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a narrow dirt road, slouched in on itself like it had been keeping secrets too long. Inside, the diary waited in an evidence bag on the kitchen table. The raincoat had gone stiff from time, still smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something sweet and sickening. Meredith didn't need to read much. Just the drawings. The handwriting. The references to Mrs. Sparrow, a name Eliza used in games when she was scared. It was hers. The past hadn't stayed buried. It had been waiting just 3 miles away. The old Holloway house had been quiet for nearly 2 decades. But Meredith stood in the kitchen, staring at the diary through the clear plastic bag like it was radioactive. She didn't ask to hold it. She wasn't sure she could. The officer on site was young. Too young to remember 2005, probably too young to remember Eliza's face on the news. He spoke gently as if Meredith were fragile glass. The writing matches samples from her school journals. We're verifying with the state lab, but... Meredith cut him off. It's hers. The certainty in her voice made even him go still. The entries, what few were readable, were filled with uneven, childish scrawl. Some of them made little sense, looping in circles like Eliza had been trying to calm herself. Others were terrifying in their clarity. Mrs. Sparrow came again today. She doesn't like it when I cry. He said if I stayed quiet I'd get to go home. I think he lied. The man in the suit prays funny. I don't think God can hear him. Names. Phrases. Images that tore through the years like claws. Meredith had forgotten how Eliza called her imaginary protector Mrs. Sparrow, after a stuffed bird she'd once won at a church carnival. But there it was again, surfacing from beneath layers of time and silence. The police reopened the case that afternoon, but Meredith could already feel the weight of their reluctance. 2 decades gone. No suspects. No crime scene. A house that had passed through 3 owners and sat empty for the last 8 years. The kind of cold case no one wanted to thaw. So she began her own search. The house had once belonged to Reverend Silas Holloway, the senior pastor of Gracewood until his sudden death in 2006. He'd retired not long after Eliza's disappearance, citing spiritual fatigue. Some in the congregation whispered it was grief. He had, after all, lost a wife to cancer and had raised his son alone. Others said it was guilt, though no one had ever said why. Standing on the porch of that house now, Meredith couldn't remember a single sermon he'd preached. Just the way he looked past you like he was already somewhere else. She asked the officers for access to the basement again. They said no. She asked to read the rest of the diary. Another no. They didn't say it aloud, but she heard the subtext in every pause. We don't want to relive this. And we don't want you to either. But for Meredith it had never stopped. Back at home, she sat on the floor of her living room surrounded by old photos, yearbooks, church newsletters. Clues that weren't clues yet. She thumbed through them with the quiet steadiness of someone preparing for war, not of anger but of memory. It had rained that weekend. Not a storm, just a slow gray drizzle that soaked the forest floor and made the wooden cabins at Haven Glen smell like damp bark and old Bibles. Meredith still remembered the way the bus driver leaned out and waved when the church van pulled away, Eliza craning her neck out the window, too excited to sit still. "We'll send photos," one of the youth volunteers had called out. "Don't worry, she's in good hands." That phrase, good hands, would echo through Meredith's memory for years. She trusted those hands. The church, the leadership, the community she had baked pies for and prayed beside. And then, after that weekend, nothing. Eliza had vanished during the second day of the retreat. The timeline, as Meredith remembered it, was maddeningly mundane until it wasn't. Watch. Scripture memorization. Rain light at first, then heavier. Most of the kids stayed inside, playing board games or braiding each other's hair. But some went out. A small group, unsupervised for just 20 minutes. The counselors had let them play tag in the clearing near the woods. Eliza was last seen running toward the treeline in her yellow raincoat, laughing. And then she was gone. Search teams scoured the forest for days. Helicopters. Tracking dogs. Volunteers. The nearby lake was dragged twice. The working theory had always been simple. She wandered too far, got lost, succumbed to the elements. A tragedy but explainable. But now Meredith couldn't stop thinking about the houses. The campground sat on the edge of a small residential road. 5 houses dotted the curve of the treeline. Nice ones. Porches. Wind chimes. One of them had belonged to Reverend Holloway. But the search never touched those homes. The focus was the forest, the wilderness. The narrative demanded it. A child lost in the woods was a clean sorrow, a heartbreak with no villains, just circumstance. There had been one odd thing though. Meredith remembered it like a pebble in her shoe, something she'd always meant to dig out but never had the strength to. One of the adult volunteers, a man named Brian Keller, had left the retreat early. Claimed he was sick. Fever, nausea. Said his wife was coming to pick him up. No one questioned it. But the next Sunday he wasn't in church. And the one after that he was gone. Moved out of state, someone said. Job change. No forwarding address. Just another door that quietly closed behind her daughter's disappearance. Meredith didn't mention Brian to the police. Not yet. She wanted more than memory. She needed something real. Back in her bedroom, she opened the cedar chest where she kept Eliza's things. Inside, a folder marked Retreat Info. She found the list of attendees, laminated, slightly faded. There it was, Eliza Clark. Brian Keller, adult chaperone. The forest hadn't swallowed her daughter. Someone else had. Meredith began with names. Not just Brian Keller but everyone from the retreat roster, volunteers, youth leaders, even the kitchen staff. She made a spreadsheet, color-coded the columns. It was the kind of obsessive work that once might have been a coping mechanism, but now felt like preparation. A map of ghosts, one by one. She started with quiet visits. Phone calls. A few Facebook searches. Most people were polite if uncomfortable. Some didn't remember much. Others remembered too well and didn't want to talk. The passage of time had blurred the edges of those 3 days into something resembling safety. But not for her. She tracked down the last remaining relatives of Reverend Holloway, his niece, a hospice nurse in Albany. The woman's voice went sharp the moment Meredith mentioned the house. We sold it years ago. Didn't even go inside. Just got it cleared out and signed it over. She hung up before Meredith could ask about the Reverend's son. That name kept coming up, quietly, obliquely. The Reverend had a son. A quiet boy. Homeschooled. Kept out of sight during church events. Meredith remembered a flicker of him at a holiday potluck. Pale, watching everything from behind a curtain. But his name was never listed on the church records. No one had ever looked into him. Still, there were small breakthroughs. In the church basement, sorting through donation boxes for the summer food drive, Meredith opened an old trunk labeled Retreat Supplies. Inside, beneath tarps and felt puppets, lay a stack of VHS tapes, bulky, unmarked except for dates scrawled in fading Sharpie. One was labeled simply, 2005 Church Retreat. She didn't breathe for a full minute. That night, she borrowed an old VCR from the church's AV closet, hauled it home, and fed the tape into her dusty television set. The footage was grainy, a shakily filmed montage of children singing, eating, playing tag on the muddy field. Meredith scanned every second for her daughter. And then she found her. Eliza, near the edge of the group, darting between other kids in her unmistakable yellow raincoat. Laughing. Free. And then, Meredith's breath caught. A man's hand enters the frame from the right. Not aggressively. Casually. Reaching. Eliza turns toward him, then looks back once. She follows. The camera pans away too fast. But Meredith rewound it again. And again. A blurred figure in the background. Tall. Wearing a dark suit. The face never comes into view. But something about the posture, rigid, measured, rehearsed, made Meredith's stomach turn. She brought the tape to the police the next day. They watched it. Paused. Rewound. But their conclusion was maddeningly dismissive. It's inconclusive, Mrs. Clark, the detective said. Could be anyone. Could be nothing. Meredith nodded politely. She thanked them. And then she went home and watched it again until the tape nearly wore thin. Because she knew what she saw. The raincoat. The hand. The look over the shoulder. Eliza had followed someone. Someone she knew. The Holloway house stood empty. No tape across the doors. No uniformed presence. Just silence and rot. Meredith didn't ask for permission this time. It was early evening when she parked at the edge of the property, headlights off, heart thudding like a slow drumbeat behind her ribs. The clouds had thickened, low and heavy, smothering the light in a blue-gray hush. She let herself in through the kitchen door, its lock barely functional after years of weathering. Inside, the air was still and cold. Dust lay thick across every surface, like the house had grown a second skin to keep the past hidden. She moved slowly, room to room, flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Her fingers brushed across door frames, wallpaper seams, remnants of a life abandoned in a hurry, broken teacups, mildewed hymnals, a shoe left under a radiator like its owner had vanished mid-step. The diary had been found in the basement. But Meredith's instincts pulled her upward. The second floor groaned beneath her weight. She entered the attic through a narrow stairway that smelled of old smoke and insulation. The air thinned the higher she climbed, and for a moment she had to stop and close her eyes. Eliza was here, she thought. In this house. In these walls. She found the hatch tucked behind a loose panel in the attic floor, just large enough for a small person to crawl through. She hesitated. Her hands shook as she pushed the panel aside. What she found inside wasn't just evidence. It was memory made physical. The crawlspace was a shallow, suffocating void lined with splintered beams and thick dust. At first she saw nothing, just shadows. Then the beam of her flashlight swept across something pale. A plush lamb, dirt-stained and curled into itself. A toy Eliza had taken everywhere. Next to it, a pair of small sneakers. One was chewed at the toe as if by rodents. A bundle of crayon drawings were pinned beneath an overturned soup can, figures with big heads and frantic lines. One drawing showed a girl in a yellow raincoat holding hands with a tall man in a black suit. The man's face had been scratched out violently. Over and over. She knelt in the tight space, breath ragged. The silence wrapped around her like a noose. There was something else too, etched into the wood beside the lamb. Scratched deep like it had taken hours. Maybe days. Eliza was here. The lettering was crooked. Desperate. Meredith didn't cry. Not yet. Her body felt frozen, detached, as though this wasn't her life at all, just some unspeakable dream she had to keep walking through. Later, she would sit in her car, soaked in the weight of that attic, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left. But in that crawlspace, what she felt wasn't closure. It was presence. Eliza had been hidden. Not lost. And someone had made sure she stayed that way. The story broke small, just a local paper headline: Mother of Missing Girl Reopens Holloway House Mystery. A 2-paragraph piece with a blurred photo of the yellow raincoat, folded beside the crawlspace hatch. It should have been a dead end. But someone was watching. A week later, a man named Marcus Lane, former handyman for Reverend Holloway, left a voicemail on Meredith's church office line. His voice was thin, strained, the kind that sounded like it hadn't been used in a while. I saw the article. I think I have something to tell you. About the house. About, back then. They met at a diner halfway between Franklin and Brattleboro. He showed up late, hands shaking as he stirred sugar into a coffee he never drank. Mid-60s, sun-leathered face, shoulders hunched like someone who had lived with regret too long. I kept my mouth shut for years, he said. Didn't want to believe what I thought I saw. Meredith leaned forward. What did you see? Marcus glanced around the nearly empty room, then lowered his voice. Back in '05, the Reverend asked me to board up a wall in the basement. Said it was for insulation. But the thing is, it was already insulated. And I remember the smell. Damp wood, yeah, but something else too. Sweet. Like rot under paint. Meredith's stomach twisted. You didn't report it? I told myself it wasn't my place. That it was just an old man trying to keep heat in. But that wasn't it. He looked at her now, eyes wet. It didn't feel right. That house, it had, wait. Like it was watching you. Meredith slid a photo across the table. One of the crayon drawings from the attic. The man in the suit with no face. Marcus stared for a long moment. That's him, he whispered. That's the Reverend's son. Thomas. The name came like a punch to the chest. Thomas Holloway. A name Meredith had never heard during the investigation. No police file. No interviews. Like he'd been written out of the story before it was even told. He was kept quiet, Marcus said. Homeschooled. Never came to church. But I saw him a few times, wandering the hallways watching me from corners. The Reverend said he had a condition. Said it was best if Thomas stayed away from the congregation. And no one asked questions? Meredith asked, voice tight. Marcus shook his head. People trusted Holloway. He was the pastor. You don't question the shepherd. The coffee had gone cold between them, untouched. I think the boy was disturbed. He had this blank way of looking at you like he didn't see people. Just puzzles. Marcus looked down at his hands. I didn't want to believe he had anything to do with that girl going missing. But when I heard about the diary, what she wrote, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Meredith left the diner knowing two things. Eliza hadn't been lost. And the Reverend wasn't the only one in that house with something to hide. Thomas Holloway was living under a different name now. Meredith found him listed as Thomas Rayner, a grief counselor at a small clinic in New Hampshire, just over the state line. His staff photo showed a man in his early 40s with pale eyes, sandy hair and a soft, practiced smile. The kind that looked sincere until you studied it too long. She didn't tell the police. She booked a session. The office was quiet, almost sterile, muted lighting, pale gray walls, a sound machine humming in the corner like distant waves. Meredith sat on the edge of a faux-leather couch while Thomas, Rayner, took his seat across from her, notepad resting loosely on one knee. He didn't recognize her. Not at first. "I lost someone," she said. "A long time ago. A child." He nodded, expression unreadable. "I'm sorry. Can I ask how old they were?" 10, she said, her voice steady. She disappeared during a church retreat. In 2005. Franklin, Vermont. There was a flicker, barely perceptible. A tightening around the mouth. He didn't write anything down. "And how long ago did she?" he asked carefully. "She never came home," Meredith said. "Until now." She reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. Not of Eliza. Not of the retreat. But of the crawlspace. The etched message. Eliza was here. She placed it gently on the coffee table between them. Thomas didn't speak. His eyes lingered on the photo. His jaw moved slightly like he was chewing on the inside of his cheek. And then he leaned back very slowly and closed his eyes. "I wasn't supposed to let her die," he whispered. The room went utterly still. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. Thomas opened his eyes again. Red-rimmed. Blassy. "She was sick. She started coughing the second week. I didn't know what to do. I told him we needed to let her go, take her to a doctor. But he said no. That it would ruin everything." "Who?" Meredith asked, though she already knew. "My father," he said. "He said Eliza was chosen. That if we followed through, if she stayed quiet long enough, something holy would happen. She'd be saved. We all would." He wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his sweater, like a child caught in a lie. "I kept her in the basement when she got worse. I thought it would pass. I thought God would fix it. He didn't." Meredith stared at him. She could hear her pulse in her ears. "And when she died?" she asked. "I wrapped her up," he said quietly. "Behind the chimney. He told me to seal it off. Said if we buried her properly the police would come. This way it would stay quiet." Meredith stood. Thomas didn't try to stop her. He just whispered, "I still hear her. At night. I think she forgave me before I did." She paused at the door. "You don't get forgiveness," she said. "Not from her." And then she left. The next morning, Meredith drove straight to the police station. She didn't ask for an appointment. She placed the audio recorder on the desk, played the confession, and waited. The detective listened in silence, his jaw tight, fingers steepled in front of his mouth. There were no interruptions. No arguments. They believed her now. Within hours, a warrant was issued. The Holloway house was cordoned off, a forensic team dispatched. Meredith wasn't supposed to be there, but she came anyway. Stood behind the police tape with her arms crossed tight across her chest as if holding her own ribs in place. Thomas had told her the truth, or at least enough of it. "There's a hollow behind the chimney," he'd said, voice cracking. "He made me build it. Said it had to be secret. Sacred." He hadn't cried then. He'd gone still instead, frozen in the wreckage of his own guilt, a man suspended in time. The forensic team worked carefully. Floorboards were pulled. Mortar chiseled. Hours passed. Then a call went out, low and urgent. One of the officers emerged pale-faced, sweat beading along his brow despite the cold. "We found her." Beneath the brick, in a cavity no larger than a child's coffin, lay the remnants of a body. Decayed, discolored. But around the neck, still fastened like a promise, was a thin silver chain. Eliza's locket. Meredith didn't move. Didn't speak. She watched from the edge of the yard as the stretcher was lifted. The sheet pulled just far enough to confirm the unimaginable truth. She didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. The house behind her, the house that had held her child in silence all these years, seemed smaller now. Less monstrous. A hollow shell crumbling under the weight of what it had hidden. Thomas was arrested later that day. Voluntary manslaughter, unlawful imprisonment, abuse of a corpse. He didn't resist. Didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat in the back of the cruiser, staring down at his hands. "I wanted to believe it meant something," he told the officers. "That she'd be saved. That I'd be saved. But it was all a lie. My father, he made me believe it. There was no grave yet, but there would be. Meredith would choose a place near the woods, quiet, not far from where Eliza had last been seen. This time there would be flowers. A name etched in stone. She walked through the house once more before it was sealed. Not to punish herself. Not to remember. To say goodbye. In the corner of the attic crawlspace, the crayon drawings still lay where she had found them. Meredith knelt down, fingertips tracing the outline of a girl in a yellow raincoat. She stayed quiet, she whispered. But not forever. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence in her chest lifted. Just a little. It was a small service. Just close friends, a few former church members, and the handful of neighbors who had never stopped leaving porch lights on every July. They gathered on a mild autumn morning beneath a canopy of gold-turning trees, their breath just beginning to cloud in the air. There was no sermon. No grand eulogy. Just silence and the soft sound of wind moving through the branches. Eliza's grave was set in the corner of Pine Hollow Cemetery, under an old sugar maple. The headstone was simple, like Meredith had asked. Eliza Clark. 1995 to 2005. She was loved. She was brave. Meredith stood alone after the others left. The wind tugged gently at her coat. In her hands she held the diary, still warped, still water-stained, still wrapped in that same yellow raincoat. She'd thought about burying it, about leaving it with Eliza like some kind of offering. But she couldn't. It was more than paper. It was a voice. A map. Proof that even in fear, her daughter had refused to disappear. Eliza hadn't screamed. Hadn't fought. She'd written. Drawn. Carved her name into the dark, knowing someone, someday, might find it. That was courage. That was survival. Meredith whispered, "You're coming home now," and tucked the raincoat under her arm. There would be no justice that could measure what had been lost. No sentence long enough. But the truth had surfaced. The silence was broken. The girl in the yellow raincoat would never again be just a face on a flyer or a question left hanging in the back of a church bulletin. She was known now. Fully. Finally. In the weeks that followed, Meredith found herself sleeping again. Not deeply, not without interruption, but enough. The house felt less like a tomb and more like a place where life might happen again. She kept teaching Sunday school, though she swapped the usual coloring sheets for stories about standing up, speaking out even when you're small. She told them, "Your voice matters even when no one's listening yet." One afternoon, Meredith walked the long path past the old church. The same stretch she'd taken 20 years earlier when Eliza had been just a girl in rain boots, swinging her lunchbox like it was a lantern. Now she passed by alone, the sun hanging low, the ground brittle with early frost. In her hand she held the diary. A bench sat just outside the chapel. She sat down slowly, the wood creaking beneath her weight, and opened the first page one more time. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out." She smiled just a little. Not from joy. From recognition. Because in the end, Eliza had made it out, on her own terms. Not alive but not lost. Not forgotten. She had left breadcrumbs. And her mother had followed them home. She stayed quiet like he asked. But she still found her way out. Drop a comment below and tell us, did Eliza's story end in justice? Or is there still more buried beneath the Holloway house? Hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chilling deep dive into true crime-inspired mysteries.